The deck was not merely cold. It was a thief of heat. A black metal mouth pressed to Maya Lee's spine, drawing warmth through flight suit fiber, through skin, through the old ache welded into his bones since the border campaigns where men slept against reactor housings and still woke shivering. The sound above him came in jagged pulses instead of clean intervals. Klaxon. Silence. Klaxon, klaxon. A stutter like a heartbeat learning fear. Somewhere aft, plating ticked as it cooled. Somewhere forward, something liquid dripped in patient, metallic beats. The courier's cabin smelled wrong. Not just burnt polymer and electrical ozone, not the ordinary perfume of a bad landing, but wet copper and crushed green sap, and a sweet ion tang that belonged to open jungle, not a sealed ship hull. He opened his eyes to red emergency strips and a ceiling that had become a wall. His first breath hit like sandpaper. His second breath tasted coolant. His third came with memory, partial and sharp. Upper atmo turbulence over Vespera 9's feral belt, Navgos where no satellites should have been, then a harmonic shriek across the hull as if a giant instrument string had been plucked around his ship. Not impact exactly. Capture. The craft had not fallen free. It had been dragged, steered, corrected by a frequency trap keyed so precisely. It felt personal. The realization tightened his chest harder than the crash. Vespera 9 was listed unregulated frontier biome, low orbital governance. Unregulated worlds did not run synchronized frequency nets in storm cover. A cable sparked over his head and spat white light across the cabin. Maya flinched, rolled his shoulder, and discovered gravity had settled at a cruel angle. 20 degrees off true deck, enough to make every movement slide and jar. His left knee barked when he tried to fold it under him. His mouth filled with the copper taste again, and for one suspended second he thought it was blood. His blood. But the taste drifted in waves with the damp breeze leaking through a split seam by cargo hatch 3. Outside, rain hissed against hot hull plating. Leaves scraped metal in slow dragging strokes, like claws testing thickness. Courier Unit Hail 7, the onboard voice croaked from a blown speaker grill, each word blunted by static. Primary flight controls non-responsive. Structural compromise at 42%. Please remain seated for... The rest dissolved into a burst of high feedback that made his ears ring. He laughed once, short and dry. Good talk. The laugh steadied him more than it should have. He blinked hard until the red emergency lights stopped doubling, then braced one palm on the skewed deck and pushed himself to his knees. The movement sent a wave of nausea through him, cold and immediate, but he wrote it out by focusing on tactile facts. Rough, anti-slip ridges under glove, the vibration pattern of a wounded engine winding down, and the thin thread of wind breathing through split plating at measured intervals. Wind meant breach. Breach meant atmosphere. Atmosphere meant he had made surface alive, which was more than most courier contracts promised. A low thump rolled beneath him. Not thunder. Engine recoil from outside. Heavy, periodic, mechanical. He froze and listened. 1, 2, 3 beats of rain hiss, then the thump again, closer, accompanied by a high rotating whine that climbed and dropped in disciplined arcs. Drones, his mind supplied, and his pulse stepped up in answer. Orbital-class rotors had no place over a feral belt unless someone was enforcing boundaries no one admitted existed. The official maps called Vespera 9 a patchwork of sovereign clan territories and unclaimed hunting zones, dangerous but politically diffuse. Diffuse did not produce synchronized rotor packs. The cabin lights dimmed to a rust-red murk. Condensation gathered on exposed conduit and fell in cold taps against his wrist. He tasted damp mineral in the air now, basalt and wet ash beneath the copper sap blend, as if the ship had buried itself in volcanic glass and vine roots. The smell profile shifted with each gust through the seam. Fungal musk, flowering toxin, a peppery animal scent so faint he almost dismissed it until it returned stronger and came with distant throat-click calls rising and cutting off in disciplined patterns, not random wildlife chatter, patrol language. The crash had made noise enough to draw everybody. Maya dragged himself sideways across the tilted cabin, boots sliding, shoulder clipping a bent restraint frame. His suit servos whined under strain, the old model lagging half a second behind intent. He had bought this suit from a salvage lot on Port Trellis because it was cheap and sealed, not because it liked jungle humidity or emergency crawling. By the time he reached the cracked side viewport, sweat cooled between his shoulder blades despite the cold deck. He wiped grime with his sleeve and leaned close. Jungle pressed against him like a living wall. Fern fronds wider than his torso trembled in rotor wash. Trunks of black, basalt-veined wood rose through steam in layered columns, and on 3 of them he saw streaks of cobalt resin painted in parallel claw marks, each line precise, each set at shoulder height for something much taller than him. The paint glowed faintly in the red wash from his cabin lights, turning the trees into warning posts. Territory signs. Royal, if the dock rumors were true. On Vespera 9, Cobalt belonged to bloodlines that did not negotiate with trespassers until after judgment. Good, he muttered. Love walking into local customs blind. The joke landed in the empty cabin and stayed there. Another external thump, now to starboard. Rotor whine split into 2 harmonics, then 3. He tracked by ear, building angles from sound because the viewport gave him only jungle and steam. 1 drone above canopy line, 2 lower, likely scanning heat through foliage. He could almost see their old war silhouettes in his head, armored bellies, sensor tusks, obsolete but ruthless targeting routines that treated uncertainty as contamination. His fingertips went numb, then hot, then steady as adrenaline found familiar channels. He did not name the memory that tried to surface with the sound. Naming made it bigger. Courier Unit Hale 7, the ship voice said again, then coughed static. Life support reserve estimate, 47 minutes in current breach state. Put it on my calendar, he said, voice softer now. The internal gravity compensator failed completely with a shuddering pop. Loose items drifted an inch, hung, then slammed downhill as raw planetary pull took over. A storage bin burst open and packet rations skittered past him like startled fish. 1 med patch canister spun in place before vanishing under twisted seating rails. Maya reached for it and winced when his wrist protested. Pain cut through fog better than alarms. He flexed his fingers and watched them obey. The red strip lights died. Darkness took the cabin in 1 clean bite, and for a moment the world reduced to sound and temperature. Rain hiss, distant rotor saw, drip of coolant, the cool exhale from a hull breach on his cheek, and beneath all of it a faint subsonic hum that made his teeth ache. He had heard that hum once before on a decommission line, where old autonomous systems slept in crates and still talked to one another through shielding. Machine chorus. Networked. The jungle answered with a call, 2 fast throat clicks, 1 long descending trill, from somewhere near the torn cargo hatch. Another call echoed farther away. Same cadence, confirming receipt. His pulse climbed, but his thinking sharpened with it. Whoever owned this forest had eyes on the wreck, and discipline enough to report without panic. The drones were searching. The clans were converging. He was the loud, warm problem in the middle. A hand-sized panel on the far wall flickered to life in ghostly green, powered by reserve cell. The display mapped nothing useful, just a fractured wireframe of his ship with warning glyphs, stacked like accusations. One icon blinked near cargo bay shielding, amber, then red, then amber, as if deciding whether a particular compartment still existed. His gaze snagged there longer than he intended. Not now. First breathe, move, exit. He inhaled for 4, held for 4, exhaled for 4, and listened to the count ride the noise without drowning in it. On the second cycle, his heartbeat slowed enough for details to separate. Rain was tapering. Rotor whine drifted west, chasing something or being baited. Throat click calls moved closer, then stopped at a ring around his wreck instead of rushing in. Tactical pause. Assessment. "Anybody out there?" he said to the darkness, not loud, not pleading. "I'm not here to hunt your people." Silence answered, but not empty silence. Waiting silence. Then, from directly above the split seam came the whisper of weight on hull plating. Light, controlled, and bipedal for the first 2 steps before shifting into a 4-point glide that distributed mass almost perfectly. Predatory movement, trained and deliberate. A small shower of ash shook loose through the seam and dusted his shoulder, dusted his. He did not reach for a weapon. He kept one hand visible on the deck and turned his head toward the sound, every sense stretched thin enough to ache. Outside, rainwater ran down the broken metal in silver threads. Inside, his breath fogged and vanished. The next sound was a claw tip tapping once against the hatch from the other side, polite as a knock, final as a verdict. He held still through the echo of that single tap, spine angled against the slanted deck, gloved palm open on the metal where anyone looking through the seam could see he was not reaching for a weapon. The hatch did not rattle. No second knock came. Whoever waited outside had offered one formal notice and expected comprehension. Maya swallowed against a dry throat and let the next breath move on count instead of fear. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The ritual had survived 3 theaters, 2 hospital wards, and 1 tribunal interview, where his hands had shaken so hard he could barely sign his own name. It could survive a broken courier in a feral jungle with something predatory on the other side of thin metal. He repeated the cycle, then another, feeling his pulse drop from sprint cadence to working cadence. Panic burned oxygen, precision, and judgment, always in that order. He had too little of all 3 to waste. He eased his weight toward the console lip and listened. No scrape of claws, no breath plume through the seam. Just rain thinning over hull plates and the distant turbine keening of old drones quartering the canopy. He tested his left wrist again. Pain. Sharp but clean. No grinding instability. Usable if he taped it. His right knee flexed with a hotter complaint, then steadied. Also usable. He needed usable, not comfortable. A cracked emergency strip near the floor blinked once, enough to silver the cabin and vanish. In that brief flash, he picked out what mattered. 1 plasma cutter jammed under a folded restraint arm, 2 med patches half-pinned by ration packs, and the flight satchel that carried the mission shard wedged beneath a buckled bulkhead rib. He moved in sequence because sequence meant control. Cutter first. Med patches second. Satchel last. The cutter came free with a gritty tug and a hiss from its damaged capacitor. He thumbed the status rune. Amber, not green. 40% charge and unstable beam focus. Good for cutting panel seams and making bad decisions. Not good for a firefight, which suited him because he had no interest in starting one. He clipped it to his thigh and crawled for the med patches. 1 was intact. The other had hairline fractures in its polymer shell. He palmed both anyway, then trapped them between teeth while he reached into the shadow under the buckled rib. His fingers touched canvas, then the hard geometry of the sealed shard case inside the satchel. Relief arrived so hard it almost made him dizzy. The case was uncracked, cold as stone. Tribunal records still aboard, still locked. All the names of missing low-caste workers, all the transport manifests rewritten by somebody with government access, all the signatures that could prove those disappearances were policy, not rumor. He pressed the satchel to his chest for a second longer than necessary, then looped it cross-body and cinched it tight. The hatch stayed silent. "Understood," he said, voice low, directed at metal and whatever waited beyond it. "One knock. I heard you." No answer came, but the absence did not feel empty. It felt observed. He set the intact patch across his left wrist, triggered the release membrane, and hissed as biofoam tightened under the glove cuff. The pressure cut pain to a manageable line. The cracked patch he split with his thumbnail and spread as conductive tape over a tear in his suit seam at the ribs. Not pretty, but it slowed heat loss and kept jungle moisture from wicking straight to skin. He checked his suit's microfilter readout. The display spiderwebbed and flickered between nonsense symbols before settling on breathable with toxin variants. Useful as a weather vane, nothing more. The onboard speaker coughed static again. Remain seated. Rescue estimated. The rest dissolved into a low gargle. Maya glanced toward the DEDCOM panel and barked a quiet laugh. "If rescue finds this address, I'll frame the invoice." Humor took a little pressure off his diaphragm. Enough to think clearly. On the lower diagnostic strip, the bay shield icon for compartment C9 kept blinking an angry crimson. Unstable field, high-value lock still active. He tried a manual override, got a dead bus fault from the collapsed midship spine, and tagged it in memory as a timed risk to return to if the wreck held that long. He needed out of the fuselage before the drones completed a thermal sweep, but not through the main hatch where polite claws had just posted terms. He slid to the side seam by cargo hatch 3 and peered through the split where wind came in. Steam drifted in horizontal sheets across fern crowns and basalt trunks marked with those cobalt claw lines. No bodies, no eyeshine. Yet the undergrowth held itself in a listening posture, leaves barely moving despite wind shear, as if a ring of hunters had gone still on command. Within the next minute, he committed to a route. Breach seam, down the external hull scar, then into the lava glass gully 10 meters west, where foliage thinned and his thermal signature might blend with warm rock vents. It was a worker's plan, not a hero's plan. Small movements, ugly angles, no silhouettes. He unsealed the split seam with 2 quick cutter bursts, keeping the blade low, so glare stayed inside the cabin, then widened it just enough for shoulders and satchel. Metal shrieked once. He froze. Outside, a throat click answered from farther downslope. 2 short, 1 long. A relay, not an alarm. He went through anyway. Rain struck his face like cold needles, and then stopped as the canopy shifted overhead. The whole skin was hotter than he expected, steaming where water hit it, and slick with ash. He lowered himself 1 grip at a time, boots searching for purchase along torn plating, while the jungle breathed around him in wet mineral pulses. The smell was richer outside, wet copper from disturbed soil, ionized pollen that tingled behind his eyes, fungal musk thick as fabric, and beneath all of it the pepper-warm animal scent from before, now layered with smoke and resin. At ground level, he crouched in the shadow of his own wreck and forced another breath cycle. In for 4. Hold. Out. Scan. His ship had punched a furrow through black laststone and young trunk growth before lodging at an angle against a basalt outcrop. Fragments of hull plating lay fanned like scales across mud that reflected the emergency red still leaking from the cabin. Around the crash scar, he counted prints, not random. Four-toed, retractile claws, digitigrade stance, different mass classes. At least 6 individuals had circled the wreck after impact. None had stepped into the furrow's center where he crouched now. Boundary discipline, territory law in physical form. A soft, metallic chime drifted from somewhere uphill, then another, not mechanical enough to be drone hardware. Rank bells, maybe, the kind dockside stories assigned to clan officers who wanted subordinates to hear authority before they saw teeth. He kept his head down and moved for the gully, staying below fern line. Every 3 steps he paused to listen, building a map from sound vectors and scent shifts because visual range in this jungle was a joke the planet told outsiders before it swallowed them. By the time he reached the first basalt lip, he had his 3-tier threat model assembled and constantly updating. Tier 1 lived above. Rotor drones in disciplined sweeps, old warframes by the timbre of their turbines, likely running legacy classification routines that treated humans as contaminant vectors. Tier 2 lived around, clan patrols with formal signaling language and territorial marks, socially complex, not feral in any way that mattered, and potentially lethal if he violated custom. Tier 3 lived beneath both, a hidden enforcement grid implied by that subsonic hum, and the precision of his downing trap, something networked that could read species signatures and had already chosen to net him instead of vaporizing him. Tier 3 was the one that made his skin crawl. He slid into the gully and immediately lost 10 degrees of heat to basalt shadow. Steam hissed from cracks in the stone where geothermal vents bled upward. Good cover. Bad footing. He planted each boot deliberately, avoiding mineral slicks that shone too bright. Above, a drone crossed the canopy gap, visible for only a heartbeat. Armored belly. Triple sensor tusks. Paint scorched down to primer. Concordance-era hardware. Not museum pieces. Active service. So much for unregulated, he whispered. A rustle to his left sharpened into movement, and he flattened against the rock before his brain finished naming the shape. It was not an attacker. It was a child-sized courier sled, half buried in vine and mud, with clan resin marks on its shell and a snapped anti-grav vane. Abandoned days ago, maybe weeks. He scanned for tracks around it and found only rain-softened prints heading away in orderly lines. Evacuation under control, not panic flight. That detail lodged in his mind beside the bells and the boundary discipline. This society planned under pressure. He left the sled untouched and kept moving. 3 days of orbital drift had taught him how quickly assumptions killed, and in this gully, assumptions multiplied. A cluster of blue fungi near his shoulder pulsed brighter as he passed, not bioluminescent randomness, but reactive signaling, tied to vibration. He backed away and took a higher shelf. Above him, 2 throat click bursts answered each other across the ravine. Someone had just used him to test trip flora. He felt the observation like heat on the back of his neck. Not hunting, he said under his breath, mostly for himself. Transit only. The line steadied his hands. He rounded a basalt spur and nearly stepped into a thin cable stretched ankle-high between 2 obsidian spines. The filament shimmered in rain and vanished unless seen at exactly the right angle. Alarm snare, not kill wire. He crouched, traced its anchor to a resin capsule, and noted the emblem pressed in wax at the knot. 9 claw strokes around a crescent. Royal designation, if memory from Doc Gossip held. He did not cut it. He lifted his boot over and moved on, slower now, cataloging every place where stone looked too clean or vines grew in straight lines. The gully widened near a fallen trunk petrified into black glass. He paused there, finally shielded from overhead scans, and let himself drink 2 measured sips from his belt tube. Water tasted faintly of filter carbon and pennies. He checked the satchel seals, then tapped his wrist display, coaxing life from cracked glass. A static-ridden topographic fragment loaded, enough to show his crash point, contour gradients, and an old notation. Shrine Server Complex. Decommissioned 2 kilometers southeast under volcanic shelf. The word decommissioned on frontier charts usually meant forgotten by budgets, not by machines. A low hum swelled underfoot and then resolved into patterned pulses, like distant machinery answering a query. The same tooth-aching frequency he had heard in the cabin. Hidden grid, confirmed. He crouched and pressed fingertips to the basalt. Vibrations traveled in packets, 12-count bursts separated by exact intervals. Network heartbeat. Old, persistent, and very awake. Above the ravine, bells chimed once, closer than before. No footsteps followed, just rain returning in a fine mist, each drop ticking against leaves like soft static. He looked up through a slit of canopy and caught a brief flash of cobalt resin high on a trunk, the claw marks fresh enough to glisten. Mapped, he thought. Watched, weighed, and not yet judged. He adjusted the satchel strap, checked cutter charge one more time, and chose the southeast line toward the buried server complex because it was the only location on his broken map that suggested hard shelter, power conduits, and maybe a terminal old enough to talk to whatever grid was humming under this planet's skin. He moved with shoulders low and steps careful, following vent heat and shadow seams, while the jungle tracked him in clicks, bells, and patient silence. He kept to the shadow seam beneath the basalt shelf, boots finding the dry ridges between vents, shoulders ducked against thorned fronds that clicked together overhead like teeth. The subsonic pulse under the rock stayed steady in 12-count packets, a machine heartbeat buried deep enough to feel through marrow rather than hearing, and each burst tightened the old muscles along his spine that remembered automated kill zones and the bureaucrats who called them containment. The ravine narrowed ahead into a throat of black glass, where runoff carved a silver ribbon down the center. He paused at the lip, listened, then listened again. Rain whispered. Bells chimed once, then went still. The throat click patrol language had moved upslope, farther than before, but he did not trust distance in a canyon that threw sound like a lyre. He shifted his weight to the left, ready to drop into the cut and follow it southeast toward the buried shrine server marker on his cracked display. A figure landed in front of him, without warning, not from the trail, but from above, dropping through fern shadow with the controlled silence of a trained predator. She was taller than him by half a head, striped fur dark with rain, shoulders wrapped in segmented ceremonial metal that had been repaired too many times to count, every weld line clean and deliberate. A line of tiny rank bells hung from one vambrace and gave one soft whisper as she straightened. Her eyes were gold and unblinking. Her pupils narrowed to knife slits as they fixed on his faceplate, then the satchel strap across his chest. Maya's hand moved toward the cutter before his conscious mind signed off on it. 3 other shapes resolved around the ravine rim at the same instant. Lieutenants, he guessed by armor pattern and stance, each with cobalt resin marks across their throat guards and hooked restraint cuffs clipped to belts. One was already sighting him with a compact dart projector. Another flicked her ears back and gave a short click that sounded less like speech than punctuation. The central woman did not look at them. She stepped in, seized the front of his suit at the collar, and drove him back against the glass stone wall so hard his breath snapped out. Her gauntleted hand closed at his throat. Pressure exact. Not crushing, but absolute. Cold metal, warm fur, and the scent of rain, iron, and resin filled his head in one violent blend. Unregistered human, she said in clipped trade dialect, shaped by court schooling, each syllable precise enough to cut. You cross ninth prowl sovereign lines during active coal cycle. Her fangs showed when she spoke the word coal. Maya held her gaze because looking away felt like an admission he could not afford. His pulse hammered under her hand, but his voice came out level. Didn't cross much on purpose. My ship disagreed with gravity, one lieutenant hissed. Another made a low, disapproving click. The woman's expression did not change, but her ears angled forward a fraction, as if curiosity had tapped once at the door and been told to wait. She leaned closer, rain beating on the ridge of her brow plates. State name and function. Maya Lee, contract courier. The lie tasted stale before he finished saying it. Her nostrils flared. He felt the shift in pressure at his throat, not harder, just more attentive. Function false. You smell of burned conduits and dock grease, not courier wax and paper packs. He nearly smiled despite the hand on his neck. Engineer moonlighting badly. That, finally, drew reaction. Not from her mouth, but from the lieutenant's. A ripple of quick clicks passed between them, a private channel he could not parse. Dockside rumors had said Vespera's clans mocked liars more than they punished them. If true, honesty bought him one grain of leverage. The woman released his throat only to catch his wrist, twist, and pin his hand to the wall at shoulder height with a speed that bypassed thought. Her grip found the med-patched joint and held exactly where pain flared brightest. Pain confirms truth, she said. Liar's pulse spikes elsewhere. He exhaled through his teeth and went still. You run a charming border interview. She ignored the line, eyes dropping to the satchel again. Cargo. Personal data block. Nothing that matters to your... Her claws clicked once against the satchel buckle, close enough to score the polymer without cutting it. Do not insult me in my own ravine. The bells on her vambrace whispered as she straightened to full height. Rain thickened, running down her ceremonial plates and tracing the old hammer marks along each segment. She raised one hand, palm out. The three lieutenants snapped to stillness. In witness of Fang Accords and basalt claim, she said, voice carrying now no longer meant only for him. This human is declared protected species under Sovereign Fang. The phrase hit the ravine walls and came back altered by stone. Protected species, not citizen, not guest, not prisoner. A category with teeth in both directions. The lieutenant with the cuffs looked openly startled. My queen. Trespass and false declaration trigger seizure rights. Tribunal code requires living witnesses, the woman cut in. Cull drones mark warm signatures by contamination tier. If they classify him loose, they classify this patrol compromised by proximity. Do you volunteer your den for ash cleansing? Silence answered. Even rain seemed to soften to hear it. Maya turned the title over in his head as if it were a loose bolt. My queen. So the stories had not exaggerated. Risa of the 9th Prowl stood close enough that he could count the micro-scratches on her gauntlet and smell the resin burned into her rank marks. The feared feral monarch and dock gossip had been described as a brute in jewels. The woman in front of him looked like a field commander who had survived too many procedural funerals. One of the lieutenants recovered first. If declared protected, chain custody defaults to Crown hold. We must tag and cuff. Rissa did not glance away from Maya. Tag only. Tag without cuff violates. Then record my violation with exact punctuation. The lieutenant's jaw flexed. She holstered the cuffs. A turbine whine rose overhead, closer than any previous pass, and every ear in the ravine tilted up. Maya felt it as much as heard it. 3 drones descending through canopy layers in a disciplined wedge, old rotors chopping wet air with mechanical patience. A pale scan beam lanced through leaves and painted the ravine wall in moving bars. Rissa's eyes went distant for one breath, listening to something the others did not hear, or perhaps choosing between bad options fast enough to look like instinct. Then she moved. She bit down on the inside of her wrist, hard enough to draw blood, and smeared the dark line across the cobalt seal set into her vambrace. The metal woke under contact, vents unfolding like petals. With her free hand, she snapped 3 thumb-sized capsules from a hidden channel, crushed them, and flung them into separate fissures along the ravine. East shelf, south cut, upper rim. A hot, musky citrus scent exploded outward, layered with the same iron note as her blood, then multiplied as the capsules aerosolized in the rain. Decoy pheromone beacons, Maya realized a second before the drones reacted. Their scan beams jittered, split, then swung away from him toward the 3 false trails. Targeting chirps cascaded overhead as classification routines reprioritized. One drone banked hard and clipped a branch. Another dropped lower into the wrong cut, rotors whining in sudden strain. The wedge broke formation and scattered after phantom royal signatures. Rissa grabbed Maya by the harness and pulled him down as a beam burned across the space his head had occupied. Move. He moved. They ran the south, cut at a crouch, water splashing knee-high, lieutenants peeling off in practiced patterns behind them. The ravine kinked left into a fracture where volcanic gas vented in warm bursts. Rissa hit a basalt panel with her palm. Hidden latches released with a double clack, and a narrow slit opened into darkness. Inside, she said. He hesitated at the threshold, more reflex than choice. Unknown tunnel, unknown queen, unknown legal status that sounded protective in one dialect and proprietary in another. Behind him, rotors howled back into alignment. Rissa did not shove him. She looked once toward the widening scan glow and made a small, disgusted sound. Engineer, if I wanted you dead, I would not spend blood to confuse machines. He ducked through. The slit sealed behind them with a hydraulic thud that muted the jungle to a distant drum. Warm air hit his face, metallic and mineral, threaded with old incense and ozone. Biolamps budded from the ceiling in dim blue clusters, painting the tunnel walls in marine light. The passage sloped down into carved stone, reinforced by conduit ribs and rusted maintenance rails. Not a natural cave. A repurposed shrine line wired into a server spine, exactly the kind of place forgotten by maps and remembered by people who had reasons. Their footsteps echoed in uneven sync until Rissa raised a hand and the party stopped in a chamber wide enough for 6 bodies abreast. The lieutenants took perimeter points without instruction. One keyed a jammer disk and set it on a plinth. A low white hiss filled the room as signal noise bloomed. Only then did Maya realize he was shaking. He forced his hand flat against his thigh to still it and managed, "You bleed debate drones often, or am I getting premium service?" Rissa wiped her wrist on a cloth strip and rewrapped it one-handed. "Do not mistake necessity for favor." "Wouldn't dream of it." Her gaze dropped to his satchel again, then rose to his face. In the blue lamplight, the rigid authority she wore outside looked thinner, like armor strapped over fatigue. "Now," she said, quieter but more dangerous, "you tell me why Concordance harvest drones netted your ship instead of shredding it at altitude. Machines do not improvise mercy." Maya took one measured breath. The chamber smelled of wet fur, hot stone, antiseptic resin from her bandage, and the faint electric dust of old processors warming somewhere below. Every instinct told him to hold the shard secret a little longer. Every rotor echo still ghosting through the rock told him delays were a luxury he had burned through in orbit. "I'm carrying tribunal records," he said. "Sealed. Names, manifest edits, purge routing logs. Somebody's disappearing low-caste humans along fringe lanes and scrubbing the paperwork. I was trying to move proof off-grid." One lieutenant made a sharp intake sound. Another muttered something in clan speech that ended with a word Maya recognized from dock slang as contamination. Risa did not react for 2 heartbeats. Then her ears angled back, not in threat, but in exhausted confirmation. So, the rot reached this far. By the time the next rain band rolled over the basalt above them, drumming a slow wave across the sealed stone, the chamber had become a temporary command post. One lieutenant monitoring the jammer, one on tunnel watch, one tracing drone vectors on a wrist projector that threw red arcs over old shrine carvings. Maya stood near the wall with his hands visible and his cutter clipped but untouched, protected species in theory, highly movable asset in practice. The absurdity finally caught up with him. He looked from the red arcs to the cuff still hanging at the lieutenant's belt, then to Risa's blood-dark bandage, and let the corner of his mouth tilt, despite everything. "Great," he said, voice dry enough to strike sparks. "I finally get upgraded and it's to endangered cargo." For a half-second, nobody moved. Then the tunnel watch lieutenant snorted before she could stop herself. The jammer operator made a choking sound that might have been laughter strangled at birth. Even Risa's mouth shifted by a fraction. Not a smile, but the memory of one passing through. "Cargo gets listed by weight," she said. "You are currently listed by trouble." Story of my employment record. That earned him a direct look, assessing and unexpectedly less hostile. "You cope with fear by joking." "I cope with fear by breathing in sarcasm. Breathing does the heavy lifting." Risa studied him another moment, then gave a short command in clan speech. The lieutenant with the cuffs unclipped a small identity tag instead and approached. Maya held still while she pressed the tag to his suit collar. It bonded with a faint heat pulse and projected a thin, cobalt glyph over his chest before fading. "Crown protection mark," the lieutenant said, sounding offended by every syllable. "Stay where ordered. Do not run when challenged. Do not touch children, shrines, or food stores without permission. Violate and protection dissolves." "Friendly brochure," Maya said. She bared her teeth. "It is the short version." Risa moved to a corroded console set into the far wall and slammed her palm onto an ancient activation plate. Screens coughed to life in staggered strips, lines of Concordance-era code crawling across glass older than both of them. Her shoulders squared as she read, but her left hand tremored once before she hid it behind the console edge. Fatigue, Maya thought. Or pain held on a short leash. A warning tone sounded from the lieutenant's projector. Drone vectors had regrouped, circling the ravine they had left, then widening in mathematically neat spirals. "They will pattern match the decoys within 12 minutes, the lieutenant said. "Maybe less." Risa nodded without looking away from the code. "Then, we spend those minutes correctly." She turned her head toward Maya. Engineer, bring your shard. Bas! He stepped to the console, unclipped the satchel, and set it between them on stone scarred by older emergencies. The lock lights on the case reflected in Rissa's eyes like twin embers. Outside, muffled through layers of rock, rotors hunted rain and ghosts. Inside, in blue biolamp and failing Empire code, a queen and a crash-landed mechanic bent over evidence that could unmake both their bureaucracies if they survived the next 12 minutes. The shard case accepted neither his thumb nor his voice on the first attempt, which was exactly what he had paid for when he bought tribunal-grade encryption through a dockside broker with one eye and too much confidence. Maya keyed a 6-part failover string across the latch strip, felt the lock motors hesitate, then settle into a low, waiting hum. The case wanted a second signer with adjudication clearance. He did not have one. He had a queen with sovereign authority and a chamber full of old code that still recognized rank if rank spoke the right dead language. Risa watched the lock lights cycle amber to red and back to amber. Dual attestation. Yeah. He kept his hands off the release tabs. Designed so one scared courier can't panic dump sensitive records into the nearest gossip channel. You are not a courier. Tonight I'm whatever keeps breathing. A corner of her ear twitched, almost amusement, then flattened as another tremor moved through her left hand. It was subtle until he started looking for it. A rhythmic shiver from wrist to fingertips that she masked by pressing her palm harder against the corroded console edge. Not fear, not cold. Patterned neurological fatigue. He had seen variants in veterans who ran neural jacks too long and in technicians who bypassed safe interface limits because deadlines outranked spinal health. Risa noticed where he was looking and shifted her hand behind the console. Your clearance requirement, she said, tone clipped back to command steel. Can sovereign witness satisfy? Depends on whether your sovereignty log survived 50 years of water leaks and wars. Maya tapped the nearest screen. Concordance script crawled there in narrow columns, characters built from old legal glyphs and machine shorthand. If this server still recognizes crown tags, it can co-sign the unlock. One lieutenant bristled from the tunnel mouth. Her Majesty does not submit bloodline credentials to scavenger hardware. Risa did not turn. Her Majesty submits what keeps her people alive. Hold perimeter. The lieutenant's jaw set, but she obeyed. Maya opened a port cover on the console and found exactly what he feared. Oxidized pins, mineral bloom around the ground rail, 2 contacts burned black. I need a clean bridge and a stable 5-volt trickle. This relic is one argument away from a fire. Take what you need, Risa said. He looked at his cutter, at his cracked wrist display, then at her vambrace, where the cobalt seal sat dark under drying blood. Might include that. Her stare sharpened. Explain. Not the seal itself. The bell harness wire feeding it. It's silver copper braid insulated for field weather. Better conductor than anything in this room that isn't welded to the wall. He lifted both hands, empty, to show he was asking, not taking. I can strip 3 centimeters and splice it back after. The lieutenants made identical disapproval clicks. One stepped forward before Risa raised 2 fingers and stopped her in place. You asked to cut royal insignia, Risa said. I asked to borrow wire from hardware designed to survive rain, blood, and bad decisions. She held his eyes for a long second, then unclasped the bell harness from her vambrace and dropped it into his palm. The bells gave one soft cascade, like distant glass struck with a nail. Return it functional, she said. Always the plan. He set to work on instinct and sequence. Strip braid. Clean pins with cutter heat on low fan to avoid contact warp. Use the cracked medpatch foil as an improvised dielectric. Route ground first, signal second, power last. The old ritual slipped under his breathing without permission. In for 4. Hold for 4, out for 4. Then step 1, step 2, step 3. His fingers steadied as procedure took over. Behind him, the projector lieutenant tracked drone arcs and called updates in a low military cadence. Spiral sweep collapsing. 2 signatures lost in South Cut. Lead unit reassigning toward basalt shelf. The words gave the chamber a metronome of approaching risk, but the work in his hands remained local and exact. A wire did not care about fear. A pin either seeded or it did not. Power bridge is live, he said after 90 seconds that felt like 9 minutes. Needs sovereign credential now. Risa stepped up beside him. At this range, he could see the fine line of scar tissue under her neck fur, where armor collar met skin, pale ridges radiating down beneath the ceremonial plates. Not cosmetic. Surgical entries and stress burns, repeated over years. She touched 2 fingers to the console sensor. The screen flashed denial in old concordance script. Not enough, Maya said. It wants active lineage plus command override glyph. Probably because this node was tribunal adjacent. Risa's expression did not change, but the tremor returned, stronger. She reached to her throat, hesitated, then unclasped the segmented war collar hidden under her shoulder wrap. Metal came free with a dry click that sounded private, almost indecent, in the blue-lit chamber. Without it, the fur along her spine lay flat enough for him to see the full damage track. A ladder of neural burn scars from nape to mid-back, each junction ringed in darker tissue where interface spikes had overclocked and healed badly. Fresh inflammation glowed at 3 points, skin hot and angry beneath the striped pattern. One lieutenant looked away. Another went very still. Risa kept her voice level by force. "Manual override seat," she said, tapping a recessed socket at the collar's inner rim. Cull Protocol 9 control architecture predates our current command mesh. During migration storms, it ignored civilian shelter tags. It tagged mixed dens as contamination nests and queued cleansing drones. Her claws flexed once, then curled into her palm. The tribunal at that time ruled those dens statistically expendable. The chamber went silent except for rain on stone and the hiss of the jammer. Maya had known structurally what the seed implied. Purge systems, caste law, dehumanized categories. But seeing the price written down her spine made abstraction collapse. She had not inherited authority in a clean line. She had held a failing kill network apart with her own nervous system, while institutions debated purity language. "How old were you?" he asked before he could stop himself. "Old enough to sign challenge law," she said. "Young enough to still believe law would protect children if spoken clearly." The words landed without drama, which made them worse. She seated the collar's interface plug into a hidden port beneath the console lip. Her hand shook as the contact seated, and a sharp intake of breath escaped her before she buried it. Code flooded the screens, faster now, cross-linked with Crown authentication threads and emergency command strata. The lock on Maya's shard case chirped twice and shifted to green standby. The projector lieutenant spoke, voice tighter. "Lead drone resumed track. 5 minutes to probable vector on this entrance." Risa did not look up. "Then we use 4. Maya touched the shard case but did not open it yet. His attention stayed on the tremor running through her fingers and the involuntary clench in her jaw each time a data burst pulsed through the collar interface. "That socket is feeding direct through your cervical mesh, isn't it?" "Yes." "It's spiking you." "It is functional." "That wasn't my question." Her golden eyes cut to him, bright with pain and irritation. Engineer, do not confuse operational disclosure with invitation to manage me. He met the stare and kept his tone flat. Not managing. Preventing your command processor from cooking itself before we finish. For a heartbeat, he expected her to snap him back into his place as protected property with useful hands. Instead, she exhaled once through her nose, a sound halfway between warning and surrender. 30 seconds, she said. He moved fast. From his kit, he took the cracked med patch, peeled out the conductive mesh, folded it into a narrow strip, and bridged it across the collar's exposed regulator contacts to damp the surge peaks. Not elegant. Enough to spread current load. He anchored it with a thread of resin from her own bandage roll, then checked thermal rise with his glove sensor. Try that. Risa closed her eyes as the next pulse came. The tremor in her left hand dropped from violent to manageable. Not gone, but reduced. She opened her eyes again, studying him with a new vector that had nothing to do with species classification. You repair pain like machinery. I repair overload, he said. People and machines both fail when heat has nowhere to go. The shard case was waiting. He keyed final release and lifted the lid. Inside sat the mission shard in its shock cradle, matte black, edges silvered with data lattice veins. He slotted it into the resurrected console port. The old server took a second to complain in 3 dead dialects, then mounted the archive. Names cascaded down the screen in hard white text. Transport IDs dock departures. Cargo manifests altered post facto. Human workers listed as tool inventory, then marked decommissioned at coordinates matching unregistered fringe drops. Besides several entries, secondary tags appeared in clan script. Hybrid, juvenile dependent, den transfer denied. The same structure in 2 languages. Same logic of erasure. One lieutenant swore softly in her own tongue. Risa leaned in, ears pinned back now not in aggression, but controlled fury. There, she said, claw tip hovering over a line of authorization keys. Cull protocol amendment chain. Tribunal signet with emergency purity rider. This is the route path we never proved. Maya scanned the headers, brain running parse trees as fast as eyes moved. Not full route, he said. Route adjacent. This gives us update authority for quarantine classifications in 3 sectors and command challenge rights if we can satisfy legacy handshake. Can we? He did not answer immediately. He pulled a broken stylus from the console tray and sketched timing intervals on the stone in quick shorthand. Old concordance handshake expected encrypted challenge response plus war status nonce. Their shard provided challenge keys, but no live nonce source because official war state had ended decades ago. Unless the network still believed a quarantine war persisted in dormant mode. Given drones were still hunting by contamination tier, that assumption looked less like theory and more like architecture. We can fake narrowband war resume, he said. Not global, just enough to call a command drone to an arbitration point and force a reclassification query under your sovereign tag. Risa's gaze snapped to him. Arbitration point where? He dragged the stylus tip southeast on his crude map and circled an old symbol he recognized from his cracked display. Arc Core Crater. Highest legacy antenna density. Best chance the protocol still treats it as authoritative ground. The jammer hiss deepened as an external ping struck it. The lieutenant at the projector looked up sharply. Entrance scan at upper shelf. They're here. Risa pulled the collar plug free with visible effort and refastened the war collar around her throat, face settling back into command geometry 1 piece at a time. But the chamber had changed. Her scars were no longer rumor space. They were data Maya could not unsee, context welded into every order she gave. She faced her lieutenants. Decoy pattern Delta. Draw first pass east and keep it noisy. No heroics. You live, you report. The tunnel watch lieutenant bared her teeth in salute and moved. Risa turned back to Maya and tossed his own bell wire splice cutter side up into his hand. Engineer, you said we can fake a handshake. Show me. He clipped the tool away, rolled his shoulders once, and felt the familiar narrowing of the world that came before difficult repairs and bad odds. Need your oldest transmitter, a stable power path, and 10 minutes without anyone stepping on my cables. You have 7. Then, nobody breathes near my workspace unless they outrank physics. A rough sound escaped her that might have been a laugh if laughter had armor. Proceed. By the time the next drone sweep scraped the stone above them hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling, Maya had claimed a side alcove as a field bench and laid out his inventory in exact order on a cracked shrine slab. Plasma cutter capacitor, 2 lengths of stripped harness braid, his wrist display with half a functioning antenna, the depleted med patch shell, and a fistful of corroded connector teeth scavenged from the dead console bay. He requested a power bus map. Risa gave him access codes instead of questions. He asked for signal attenuation data. A lieutenant passed him 3 years of patrol logs from her wrist stack without comment. Trust did not arrive as a speech. It arrived as hardware handed over under pressure. He built the pulse conditioner first because unstable current would fry any handshake packet before it reached the uplink. Cutter capacitor to improvised regulator, regulator to shrine conduit through braided return line, med shell foil as thermal spreader pressed against basalt to dump excess heat. Then he disassembled his wrist display and tuned its crippled antenna to the old concordance control band, chasing a frequency notch so narrow he had to adjust by listening to static texture instead of numbers. Coarse hiss meant too high. Needle whine meant too low. The right slot was a quiet gap where even interference seemed to hold its breath. Risa knelt opposite him, one hand braced on the slab, the other steady now on the collar latch, as if reminding her body who was in charge. Status. Power stable enough to be dangerous, he said. Signal path almost clean. Need command phrase and original tribunal syntax, not modern clan translation. She recited from memory without pause, each archaic syllable precise. He fed the phrase into the packet builder and layered shard keys over it, then hesitated at the final field. War status nuts. Absent. He replaced it with a crafted echo from archived purge logs, trimmed to legal length and tagged as emergency reactivation dispute, a lie shaped like procedure, which was usually the only lie old institutions accepted. Packet ready, he said. On transmit. Any command drone in range will think a tribunal challenge has been filed at ArcCorps and come verify. And if your lie fails, then we've just announced our coordinates to every hunter with rotors. Risa's pupils narrowed, then widened as she chose. Transmit. He pressed send. The improvised rig hummed, shuddered, and held. On the monitor, one line of machine text appeared in dead white script. Challenge acknowledged, arbitration vector pending. Across the chamber, the projector lieutenant stared at her screen. Drone icons that had been circling their entrance broke pattern, hesitated, then began to turn southeast in hard, disciplined arcs toward the crater line Maya had marked in dust. He let out. Risa shifted closer on the opposite side of the slab, bells removed, armor matte in the biolamp glow, all command posture and coiled fatigue. Tell me the failure sequence. Thermal bloom first, then packet jitter, then challenge authenticity drops below tribunal threshold. He nudged a connector tooth into place with cutter pliers, listening to the static through his cracked wrist display like it was surf against rock. When that happens, Anything still loyal to Cole logic reclassifies us as active deception. Penalty. He met her eyes for a second. No hearing. She gave one tight nod, accepting the answer without ceremony. What do you need from me? Steady override cadence every 20 seconds. Old syntax. Same phrase, same pitch. This rig is so patched it responds to ritual as much as signal integrity. I can do ritual. He almost said he had noticed. Instead, he handed her the stripped secondary lead. Hold this to the collar clasp when I count down. It'll use your sovereign tag as a live salt. Her gaze dropped to the wire, then back to him, measuring risk in both directions. Allowing a non-clan outsider to interface with crown credentials at arm's length was not small trust. In her world, it was likely treason dressed as necessity. She extended her hand anyway. The wire settled against her gauntlet with a tiny metallic tick. Count, she said. Maya inhaled for 4, held for 4, exhaled for 4, and let the sequence lock his voice into a metronome. 3, 2, 1. Contact. She touched lead to clasp and began the archaic phrase, the old tribunal language flowing from a throat made for command in sleepless nights. The monitor line steadied. Packet acknowledgement rates climbed by increments too small to feel and large enough to survive. He adjusted gain with 2 fingers, then 3, narrowing the uplink until interference hiss became a thin, almost musical line. Across the chamber, the lieutenant at Tunnel Watch keyed a whisper over local channel. Outer shelf signatures passing east. Decoy team still alive. Risa did not break cadence. Maya did not look up. The whole room had contracted to 20-second cycles in the fragile treaty between heat, wire, and breath. On the 4th cycle, her left hand spasmed hard enough to break contact. The monitor stuttered red. He reached forward by reflex, caught her wrist before it struck the slab edge, and guided the clasp back to the lead. Her fur was rain-cool over tendon heat. Beneath it, the tremor ran like current through bad insulation. She tensed under his grip, pupils narrowing, then held still when she realized he was stabilizing, not restraining. Again, he said quietly. Same phrase. Her jaw flexed once. She resumed. He kept 2 fingers at the base of her wrist through the next 6 cycles, pressure light and precise, giving her hand a fixed point so the tremor had somewhere to drain. The motion became mechanical, almost formal. His count, her phrase, wire contact, packet send. In another life, it might have looked intimate. In this chamber, it looked like 2 exhausted professionals refusing to let a machine define either of them. When the acknowledgement stream held green for a full minute, he released her and sat back on his heels. Sweat had soaked the collar of his suit despite the cave chill. Link is stable enough to move from deception to command lure. Risa lowered her hand slowly, testing range. You touched a queen without permission. Maya wiped his palm on his pant leg and gave her the flattest expression he had. Put it on my disciplinary file under prevented signal collapse. One of the lieutenants made a startled, involuntary snort. Risa's mouth twitched despite herself, then settled. Your file is already crowded. He looked at the monitor. Good. Means I'm employed. The chamber gave a brief, brittle release of tension. It lasted 3 breaths. He reopened the shard archive and copied 3 critical bundles: purge routing logs, amendment chain, sovereign challenge signatures, onto the shrine server's local vault, then to his wrist display's surviving memory block, then to a data wafer scavenged from the dead console. Redundancy first, heroics second. He passed the wafer to Risa. Physical copy, keep it on body. If this place burns, we still have proof. She took the wafer and tucked it under her war collar into a sealed slot. You assume this place burns. I assume old systems punish confidence. Her ears angled in acknowledgement. A useful religion. He built a second patch for her collar regulator from remaining mesh, cleaner this time, and held it up rather than reaching in uninvited. May I? She studied him for a long moment, then dipped her chin once. Permission. He moved behind her shoulder where the blue lamps painted scar tissue in pale ridges. Up close, the burns were less dramatic and more devastating. Repeated micro-injuries layered over years, each one survived, none truly healed. He seated the mesh bridge against the regulator seam and secured it with a thin wrap of resin tape, hands steady by habit. Risa stood motionless through the process except for one sharp inhale when his knuckles brushed an inflamed node. Sorry. Do not apologize for accurate work. Doc culture. We apologize to machines too. Do machines forgive? Only when bribed with maintenance. That earned him the closest thing to a real smile he had seen from her, brief and sideways, gone before anyone else could call it softness. She turned, tested the collar interface, and the tremor in her hand dropped another degree. This is better, she said, voice lower. I dislike needing this from you. Dependency's mutual, Maya said, nodding at the uplink. Your status gets us into the command layer. My patchwork keeps us from cooking alive in it. Risa looked toward the tunnel where her patrols had gone, then back to him. In Ninth Prowl law, mutual dependency can be formalized. He held her gaze, uncertain which protocol he was stepping near. Formalized how? By claim of reciprocal custody during active threat. She extended her forearm, inner wrist up, claws sheathed. The old bloodline seal glinted beneath fresh bandage. Not mating, not ownership, obligation. I keep your life under Fang. You keep my command spine from failing, until Cold Code is dead. The offer landed in him like ballast settling a ship. Legal, tactical, deeply personal without pretending otherwise. He lifted his own wrist and pressed it to hers, suit fabric against gauntlet metal, the contact point warm despite the cave air. Reciprocal custody, he said. Her bells were still off, but he could almost hear them in the silence that followed. The lieutenant at the projector broke it, voice clipped and urgent. Command drone accepted arbitration lure. Vector lock. Arc core crater. Estimated arrival 36 minutes. Additional update. 1 hunter element detached from main group and reversed course. Maya's focus snapped back to the screen. The detached icon moved fast, cutting across terrain in straight lines that ignored decoy geometry. Why split? He asked. Risa stepped to the display. Because it did not believe the first answer. The words were still hanging in the chamber when the outer shelf shuddered with a low concussion that sent dust drifting from the chamber ceiling in gray veils. Not a direct hit. Breach charge at the disguised entrance, controlled and legal by tribunal standards if they had contamination suspicion and a magistrate code. The jammer hiss wavered. Tunnel watch came over calm, breathless, but composed. East decoy engaged by loyalist wardens. They carried tribunal writ tablets, Queen. Real tablets, not forged. They're invoking emergency inspection rights. Risa's ears flattened. Under whose seal? Magistrate Kelt. Third Accord Annex. Maya glanced at her. I'm guessing Kelt isn't invited to your holiday feasts. Kelt has not held valid jurisdiction on Vesper 9 for 12 years, she said. But old machines obey old stamps. A second concussion hit. Closer. Stone rang like a struck bell. The monitor flickered as dust clogged a cooling vent on his improvised rig. He swore, pulled the vent grate, and cleared it with 2 fingers, smearing black grit across his glove. External conflict did not arrive as a dramatic roar. It arrived as paperwork with explosives attached. Risa was already issuing orders in rapid clan speech, splitting her remaining lieutenants between delay and evacuation tasks. One was to fall back through incense tunnels and collapse 2 choke points. Another was to carry the copied archive chunk to a juvenile den warden beyond tribunal sweep range. No one argued. Fear showed in scent and breath, not in obedience. Maya packed the relay components in reverse priority, saving the tuned antenna and shard interface, abandoning the cracked heat spreader that had bought them 15 critical minutes. Physical evidence he could not carry, he photographed with his wrist display and uploaded to the local vault with tamper flags. If they lost the chamber, there would still be an audit trail of what had been used and what had been left. Risa moved to him while fastening her bells back to the vambres he had rewired. Can you carry the lure transmitter at full sprint? With this knee? Define sprint. Fast enough to be shot at in 2 jurisdictions. He bared his teeth in a humorless grin. Then, yes. A tone spiked on the projector. The detached hunter icon had reached their ridge and deployed microscanners in a fan. Green cones swept toward the hidden entrance. 30 seconds to probable detection, the lieutenant said. Risa keyed open a floor hatch Maya had mistaken for decorative stone. Hot air rose from below, carrying the smell of wet basalt and ancient coolant. Service shaft to lava tubes. We exit west, surface near brine channels. Maya slung the satchel, clipped the transmitter rig to his belt, and hesitated only long enough to grab the abandoned cuff tag from the slab where it had been left earlier. He pressed it into his pocket. If tribunal wardens scanned for protected species status later, paperwork might still buy a second. Another blast rocked the entrance corridor. This one came with a shouted command in amplified trade tongue, formal and cold. By Accord Emergency Article 9, open for contamination adjudication. Risa's lip curled, not feral, but contemptuous. Adjudicate this. She slammed the hatch release fully open and gestured down. Move! He went first, boots striking ladder rungs slick with condensation. The shaft walls were lined with corroded conduits and shrine carvings worn smooth by generations of hidden transit. Above, Risa descended after him with impossible control for someone running on pain and command adrenaline, then sealed the hatch from below. Magnetic locks clamped. A half-second later, the chamber overhead boomed as the entrance finally gave way. They dropped into a horizontal maintenance tube and ran bent double through heat and mineral mist, while alarm tones chased them through stone. The tube spat them into a lava tunnel, where brine trickled through conductive channels cut by older engineers who had believed in redundancy more than glory. Maya recognized the geometry immediately and started mapping grounding options for the coming fight, even as he ran. Behind them, through layers of rock, came the distant chatter of tribunal drones discovering an empty shrine server and too many erased assumptions. Ahead, a pale circle of rainlight marked the tunnel mouth. By the time they reached it, the jungle night had deepened to cobalt and steam, and the sky above the basalt canopy pulsed with moving scan beams all turning toward the arc core line they had baited. Risa touched 2 fingers to the transmitter clipped at Maya's belt, then to her own collar, a silent check of their new obligation. Reciprocal custody stands, she said. Maya looked at the beams, at the wet black stone, at the queen who had rewritten law with blood and now trusted him with the one lie that might end an old war machine. Then let's go break a protocol. They stepped out into rain together and headed for the crater. Rain hit the crater plain in slanted sheets, warm at first from vent plumes, then suddenly cold where wind knifed down from the broken rim. Maya tasted brine and metal on every breath. The arc core basin ahead was a wound of black glass and pale steam, ringed by dead antenna spines that leaned like snapped ribs toward a sky full of moving scan beams. It was not one system, converging. It was three. Cull, drones in disciplined arcs, tribunal wardens on lower vectors, and clan runners threading the basalt with silent precision. Every hierarchy on Vespera 9 had shown up to claim authority over the same patch of ground. Risa raised two fingers and her escort split without a word. The lieutenant who had once argued for cuffs dropped into a flanking gully and vanished, bells muted with cloth wraps. The tunnel watch lieutenant peeled west to light beacon lures made from resin and heated salt, false heartbeats in the rain. Maya and Ressa cut straight for the crater lip, staying low behind obsidian vents that hissed white. At the top, his crashed courier came into view below them, half submerged where runoff had carved a channel through the impact furrow. Hale 7 looked smaller now, more tool than home, hull plates peeled open like blistered paint. The cracked cabin speaker sputtered once on proximity power. Rescue. Delayed. Stand by. Maya let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. There's your callback. Risa glanced at him. No rescue coming. Yeah. He slid down the slick glass and landed by the torn cargo bay. But it kept trying to sound polite. Inside, he moved by memory and urgency. Cutter from thigh holster to split a jammed panel seam. Satchel set high and dry on a brace. Wrist display patched to the dead diagnostic strip just long enough to pull what mattered. Flight recorder logs, net capture harmonic signature, and the blinking C9 compartment record that had haunted him since the crash. C9 was still sealed. He popped it manually and found a hardened transponder spool, tribunal stamped, tagged with species-keyed interception code. Not rumor, not inference. Direct evidence that his ship had been netted because he was human cargo carrying inconvenient data. He pocketed the spool, stripped the shattered stabilizer assembly from the aft brace, and yanked the auxiliary core bus from its mount. The core bus was heavy enough to drag his shoulder down and hot enough to sting through gloves, but it would ground a pulse better than any shrine conduit. When he climbed out, Risa had already laid out a kill geometry on the rim with 3 clan scouts, brine channels mapped in mud, antenna stubs marked, approach lanes cut with resin flags that only her people would read. She looked up once, saw what he carried, and nodded. Can you build? He dropped the stabilizer vanes in a fan across the wet stone. I can build if nobody shoots my hands. Then I will keep your hands alive. By the time the second moon broke through cloud rags, he had turned wreckage into a lattice. Stabilizer fins became phased emitters, bell harness wire became signal braid, medfoil remnants became thermal shims under the core bus. He drove grounding spikes into brine seams with the butt of his cutter and tied them back to the arc core mast with stripped conduit teeth. Ressa stood in the center lane reciting challenge law in that dead tribunal syntax, voice carrying through rain like a blade, drawn slowly. The first command drone arrived without drama, descending on silent grav vanes before rotors engaged, as if it wanted to be seen choosing force rather than needing it. Its chassis unfolded in segments, centipede limbs, sensor crown, and a central legal projector that painted white text into the rain. Quarantine adjudication. Node 9. Sovereignty tag. Disputed. All bioforms hold for purity review. Risa stepped forward, tail low, claws sheathed. 9th Prowl Sovereign challenge entered. Recognize crown and suspend cull authority. The projector flickered through old seals and rejected them one by one. Crown lineage contaminated by hybrid shelter events. Authority null. Around the rim, tribunal wardens emerged with writ tablets raised, armor clean, Faces hidden behind respirators. Their lead magistrate held out a stamp wand and shouted over amplification, "By third accord annex, all parties stand down for machine arbitration." Risa did not even look at him. "Your annex expired 12 years ago." The magistrate's wand lit anyway. Maya slammed the last connector home and shouted, "Risa, now! Force it across lane 2. She moved before he finished the sentence. Not a charge, a lure. 2 steps in, 1 step back. Challenge phrase at precise intervals that kept the node's legal stack focused on her sovereign dispute thread. The centipede frame reoriented, limbs spanning the brine channels exactly where he needed conductive contact. It fired a tagging pulse toward her collar. She twisted, took the edge of it on her gauntlet, and hit the brine with her free hand. "Engineer." He dropped to one knee, jammed the core bus into the grounding cradle, and drove current through the lattice with both palms on the breaker plates. White-blue arc leapt from vein to vein, skipped along rainwater, and climbed the command frame in branching veins of light. For one stretched second, the node tried to rewrite her tags and his species mark simultaneously, projector text cycling too fast to read. Then the intelligence stack burned out from the center, legal glyphs collapsing into static, limbs locking mid-reach before crashing into the channel with a sound like a dropped bridge. Silence followed in layers. Rotors wound down overhead. Warden's tablets went dark. The subsonic hum under the ground, the one that had ached in his teeth since he woke on the deck, stuttered, thinned, and died. Maya sat back hard in the rain, arms shaking from current recoil. Risa was beside him a heartbeat later, one hand on his shoulder, checking pupils, breath, burns. Her own collar smoked at one seam, but her voice was steady. "Look at me." He did. "Still here. Any numbness in your fingers?" "Only the useful ones." She exhaled once, sharp with relief she did not hide quickly enough. Behind them, the magistrate stared at his dead tablet, then at the smoking node, then lowered his stamp wand and said nothing at all. His loaded authority had nowhere to land. One by one, the wardens backed away from the rim and knelt to place their writ tablets on the ground, palms visible. Surrender by bureaucracy. The lieutenant who had wanted cuffs approached through steam, rain plastering fur to her cheeks. She held a data slate out to Risa first, then to Maya. "Decoy teams all accounted for. 2 minor burns, no deaths. Shrine server did not hold. Wardens breached after you left. They found empty vault shell and your tamper logs." Maya took the slate and nodded. "Good. Let them read every timestamp." Risa keyed the shard archive, the transponder spool from C9, and the flight recorder harmonics into the ARC core mast. The dead antenna shivered, accepted power from his patched lattice, and threw a narrowband burst straight up through the weather. Orbital relays caught it on second try. Confirmations came back in stacked pings, civilian, freight, then tribunal public channels forced open by emergency transparency statutes none of them had expected to use tonight. Evidence was no longer a satchel secret. It was sky broadcast. 3 days later, in the basalt court above the juvenile dens, the smell profile had changed. Less fear musk, more whetstone and cooking grain from open hearth vents. Clan elders sat to one side, wardens and dock delegates to the other. Children safely behind screened galleries where no scanner could touch them. Maya stood on the lower speaking ring in a repaired suit with scorch marks he had not bothered to hide. Risa stood on the crown step with her bells restored and the new regulator mesh visible if someone knew where to look. The former cuff lieutenant read the charter text in formal cadence, each clause etched live into slate walls as she spoke. Humans recognized as legal persons under Vespera 9 Accords, species-keyed interception banned, mixed dens protected, Purge-era tribunal annexes void, autonomous cull systems prohibited in sovereign territory with shared audit oversight. She paused once, looked at Maya, and added a rider in her own name. Protected species designation used during active threat is hereby reclassified as reciprocal emergency custody and may not be used for ownership claims. A few elders bristled. Risa's tail flicked once and the bristling stopped. Then came the practical matter that made Maya's pulse jump harder than the crater fight had. Risa descended the crown step and stopped an arm's length from him. Ninth Prowl requires a systems envoy to rebuild compliance nets without purge logic, she said, voice carrying to every stone tier. I nominate Maya Lee, engineer, witness, and co-custodian under crater law. A dock delegate muttered, he's an outsider. Risa turned her head just enough. So is justice here. No one argued after that. She faced Maya again, softer now but no less precise. Appointment includes mate candidate trial rights under my house if you choose them. Not a bond decree, not a debt call. A public path with refusal honored. He felt every eye in the court, and under that, the older tension she had named in the tunnel. Mutual dependency formalized or denied in front of history. He thought of the cold deck, the polite claw tap, the bells, the scars, the child's sled in the ravine that proved evacuations had happened in order while laws failed above them. He thought of C9 blinking red in a dying ship until he opened it and found proof. He thought of the hum finally gone. Maya lifted his wrist, palm in, the same gesture from the shrine chamber, and held it out. I accept envoy duty, he said. And I accept trial rights if we write them with the same rule set we just gave everyone else. Risa placed her wrist to his in front of the court. Equal audit. Shared veto. No sealed chambers. He almost smiled. Romantic. The former CUF lieutenant, now charter reader and apparently unwilling comedian, said from the side, try not to electrocute each other during courtship protocol. A ripple of restrained laughter moved through stone tiers and eased the room into breathing again. By sunset, the physical trail was complete. The mission shard and C9 transponder spool were sealed in a dual-key public archive under clan and civilian locks. The flight recorder copy sat in orbit mirror storage with tamper alerts. The data wafer under Rasa's collar was logged as emergency backup and notarized. Maya's cracked wrist display, finally dead, was tagged and placed in evidence instead of trash. The plasma cutter went back on his belt, recharged and legal. The old cuff tag he had pocketed was surrendered at the registry desk and marked obsolete designation, retired. When he stepped out onto the court balcony, the jungle below clicked and trilled in patrol cadence that no longer sounded like a hunt. Risa joined him without bells, just rain-damp fur and a posture that had learned cautiously how to rest. Tomorrow, she said, we inspect the old drone fields and decommission every node we can find. Tomorrow, he agreed. And after that? She looked over the dark canopy where antenna skeletons still stood waiting for new purpose. After that, we build a home faster than rot can rewrite the paperwork. Maya leaned on the wet basalt rail, shoulder brushing hers, and watched relay lights blink across Vespera 9 like cautious new constellations. The crisis was over. The work had finally begun.